Hello, everyone. Welcome to Biology of Alcohol and Other Drugs. This is Bio 185 lecture, and I am your instructor. My name is Lilia Ornelas. You can call me Dr. Ornelas. You can call me Professor Ornelas, or just Lilia. Whatever your preference is fine. So let's first do an overview of the class, like the overall picture, and then we're going to dive in to the first week's lecture. For this class, what you are going to learn about are different classes of drugs. And drugs are chemical substances that affect the normal functioning of the body and our brain. So it basically alters our brain chemistry. We will mostly be learning about psychoactive drugs, which affect the central nervous system and alter a person's behavior, their mood, and the way they think, and even their decision making. A distinction between legal and illegal drugs does not exist. Only the use of drugs is considered illegal or illegal. For example, the types of drugs that are prescribed by doctors or some that you buy just over the counter, those have an effect on your body in the same way that illegal drugs do. Okay? Except that these are just considered legal because they're not addictive and they're used medicinally. So, for example, some people use insulin, they inject insulin to break down sugar. And so these are for people who have diabetes. And that's considered a drug and that's prescribed by a doctor. Aspirin is another class of drug, which is used for like headache, pain. It's a blood thinner, and so it can have other uses as well. And you have Prozac, which alters brain chemistry, um, which is used to treat depression. And so we're going to learn about some classes of drugs that work very similar to Prozac, which are considered illegal. There's atenolol, and some people take that, for high blood pressure. And there's Benadryl, and you can just buy this over the counter, and that's used for allergies. And so all of these are examples of drugs that are either prescribed or that you can just buy at a pharmacy. The classes of drugs that we're going to learn about in this class are mostly illegal. However, some are used to treat people who are chronically ill, who are undergoing a lot of pain. Um, some drugs are now legal in some states, for example, like cannabis, and that's used to treat pain or in some patients who have issues feeling hungry. It's used to induce hunger. Um, some hallucinogens like psilocybin is legal in Oregon, and that's used to treat PTSD. Now, I don't think other states have legalized it besides Oregon, but slowly but surely, some of these drugs that are considered legal are also being used medicinally. And so the types of drugs that we're going to learn about in this class are narcotics. So these are the opioids and opiates, which include morphine and heroin, and so this is to treat pain. There are hallucinogens, which produces sensory hallucinations of all of your five body senses, and so vision and touch and hearing and whatnot. People who take hallucinogens may see things and feel things that are not there. There's also amphetamines, which is more of a stimulant, so it boosts alertness and increases activity of the central nervous system. And we're going to learn about cocaine, which is another type of stimulant, and inhalants. And so these are gases that are found in, let's say, for example, gasoline, spray cans, nail polish, even markers. There are some permanent markers that are really strong that can be inhaled. And there's also cannabis, and cannabis is basically a plant, and the flowers are inhaled or eaten. And this also produces different types of psychoactive effects that can either stimulate or calm the person down, depending on what type of cannabis. But we're going to learn all about this in detail throughout the rest of the 9 weeks. And so remember, this is going to be a pretty fast-paced class. And so you should be prepared to read and learn at a quick rate. So there's a lot of information that you will be receiving on a weekly basis. And so as soon as you get these lectures, you need to start already studying them and understanding the information as much as possible. So why do people use drugs? Some people use it for a variety of reasons. It can be therapeutic. Um, they can be to have fun, relax, forget about problems as a form of escapism, which tends to be a common thing, especially with people who have experienced a lot of stress in their life, especially traumatic stress. They may use drugs to escape their problems. Some people use it to gain confidence and socialize, others out of curiosity, some to remove personal responsibility for decisions, some to relieve boredom and stress, and others to self medicate and cope with problems. Some drugs act as depressants, which slow down the central nervous system. So these are more, they give more of a relaxing type of effect. And so they slow down the activity of the central nervous system, and some examples are heroin, alcohol, and analgesics. Other types of drugs are considered stimulants, for example, like caffeine and cigarettes. And these are sometimes referred to as uppers, and these are drugs that increase the body state of arousal, increasing the activity of the brain. And so that means that the neurons are firing more rapidly. There's more communication among the neurons, which we'll learn about later. And by the way, neurons are your brain cells. We are going to learn about the routes of administration. Um, for example, how are drugs taken? Some are ingested, some are snorted, some are smoked. And depending on the way that the drug is taken, it can either have a very strong effect on the body or somewhat of a weak effect. Some can have a rapid and short term, and others can have long term, again, depending on the route of administration, which we'll learn more about throughout the next 9 weeks. We're also going to learn about the way that drugs mimic molecules of the brain. And mimic means to copy. Like, for example, if you like the way someone is dressed and you copy their style, and so you wear the exact same thing the next day or something like that. So mimic is to like copy something. And so the reason why drug molecules are so effective is because they mimic molecules of the brain. So they're very similar in structure, in the molecular structure, to the molecules that your own brain makes. And so, for example, this here THC is a molecule found in marijuana, and this is the active compound. And so this is the molecule that stimulates brain activity. It's similar to the molecules that your own body makes, which are cannabinoids. And so these THC molecules can act on the same receptors as the endogenous cannabinoids do. And so, for example, CB1 receptors are the receptors that your own cannabinoids, so this is your body making a molecule that is basically used to treat pain. That's one of the uses why your own body would make this type of molecule. And it binds onto CB1 receptors. And THC mimics that effect. And so THC will basically hijack the same receptors that cannabinoids bind to and bind onto the CB1 receptors and have the same effect on the brain. Now, if you don't understand this now, don't worry about it. We're going to learn about the neural anatomy in a little bit more detail. But this is just, again, to give you an overview of the types of things that you learn about in this class. Drugs can block receptors as well, and that also alters the activity in the brain. For example, heroin blocks opioid receptors, which causes a lot of dopamine to be released. Now, receptors are proteins that are found throughout your cells, through your central nervous system. All of your cells have them, and they basically can receive signals from molecules, and then they tell those cells what to do. And so receptors may tell the neurons to fire more rapidly to stimulate the brain. Other types of receptors will tell, let's say, your heart cells to beat faster. And so these are kind of like signal receivers or something like that, kind of like the old school TVs. I don't even know if you guys know what an antenna is, but some of these like old school TVs, they have antennas, and these antennas are used to receive signals. That's pretty much what receptors are. And so drug molecules can actually alter the activity of those receptors, and that's how they can change the activity that's going on biologically in your body. Again, if this doesn't make sense to you right now, don't worry about it. We're going to learn about it more in detail later, but I'm just giving you an overview of what to expect throughout the next 9 weeks. Now, the reason why drugs are so addictive and popular, amongst people, why they keep taking them, is because they affect the pleasure center of the brain. And so there are certain structures in your brain that are associated with the pleasure center. For example, when you eat, you feel pleasure. It makes you feel good, and so that's why you repeat the behavior. And the pleasure center of the brain is very important because we need it to repeat behaviors that are important for our survival. And so if we didn't like eating, we wouldn't eat, right? And then if you don't eat, you'll die. And so there are pleasure centers in the brain, as they're basically like positive reinforcements. And so this is constantly manipulated, and not just by drugs, but also by other things. For example, um, your iPhone can actually stimulate, or well, you don't may not have an iPhone. You can have any type of phone, doesn't matter. But that actually stimulates the pleasure center of the brain, making you want to repeat the behavior more and more. So does social media. So does a lot of things tend to, depending on what type of addictive behavior you have. Like for example, gambling can do that. Shopping for some people, those things that are considered pleasurable, that you want to repeat over and over again, that's basically affecting the pleasure center of the brain. And really, what's going on is that there's an increase in dopamine. It all comes down to this molecule called dopamine. And so when there's an increase in that molecule, it stimulates that pleasure part of your brain, and that's what makes drugs so addictive. And remember, not just drugs, other things can be addictive too. All right, moving on. And we're going to learn about what are the pleasure centers of the brain, like which brain structures are they. We'll learn about it in a little bit more detail, probably next week, I think. All right, so what is the most commonly used drug? And this is according to the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health. This is not according to 2021, but this is what I saw last on that website. And so, does anybody know what is the most commonly used drug in the United States? According to the NIH, it is marijuana. All right, so now we're going to move on to Unit 1, and we are going to learn about the fundamentals. So, in order for you to understand how drugs work on your biology, it's important to first learn about biology. And so, we will be having a pretty heavy review of biology this week and next week. And once we do that, then we'll finally start learning about drugs and how they affect our biology. In order to better understand how drugs affect our biology, it's best to start with the fundamentals. And so that means that we're going to learn about the basics first. Again, this is heavy in biology, and we're just going to strictly learn about biology for the next 2 weeks before we start getting into the individual drugs and how they affect our body. And so we are going to, in this lecture, we're going to learn about atoms and chemical bonds, macromolecules, and the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, which are basically cells, and those are all cells of life. And we're going to learn about the structures of the cells. You can get this information from the free book that I have provided for you called Concepts of Biology, and this is a PDF book. This book is for free, and so for this week, you can use this free book. However, starting next week, you will need to use the textbook, Julian's Primer, which I do not have a free one for you. And so you need to either purchase that from the bookstore or maybe get it online or get an online, like a PDF copy online, however you can acquire it. If you decide to use an older version of the textbook, that is fine. You just are responsible for making sure that your chapters match my information. But I have no problem with you using an older version of the second textbook that is required. So I'm not talking about concepts of biology. This right here is a free book that I have provided for you. I am talking about the second textbook that you will need next week, called Julian's Drug Primer. All right, moving on. And so atoms are basically the most fundamental building block of life. Not just of life, of all matter. And so everything around you that you see is made up of different types of atoms. And so again, we're going to just build up all the way until we get to the cell. All right, so atoms, again, the fundamental building blocks of all matter. And so that means that the chair that you are sitting in, the computer that you are using, your own body, the air that you breathe, everything is made up of different types of atoms. They make up all matter. And atoms, so they come in different shapes and sizes. Not shapes, but, well, yeah, shapes. Shapes and sizes, and that's something that you would learn in chemistry if you actually are interested in more in-depth talk about atoms, but we're only going to learn about the very basics. And so all of them share in common a core nucleus, which contains protons and neutrons. And surrounding the nucleus are these other energy particles called electrons. And so these electrons basically orbit the protons and neutrons, and they are always balanced. And so if there is two protons on the inside of a core of an atom, then there are two electrons on the outside. And so if there are three on the inside, then there are three on the outside. And so every single different type of atom, which then becomes an element, is made up of a different type of core and a different type of outer shell. So let's say, for example, a hydrogen atom is made up of just one proton and then one electron, whereas a helium, this would be an example of helium, is made up of two protons and two electrons. So this is a periodic table. I don't know if you've ever seen this before or not, but these are all of the different types of atoms, and so now these are called elements. So these are all of the different types of elements that are known. Some, like down here, are lab made, meaning that humans have actually fused together some types of atoms, or like not fused, but like kind of chemically played around with them and made some new types. Whereas almost all of these are just naturally found. These are all from nature. Okay, and each different type of element has its own properties. And so hydrogen would not behave in the same way as helium, and neither would the atom called oxygen. So that wouldn't behave in the same way that nitrogen or carbon would behave. So they all have different types of properties. And the reason why they're all different is because they're all made up of a different amount of protons and electrons. And so hydrogen has one proton and electron, whereas helium has two protons and electrons, whereas lithium has three and beryllium has four, and so on and so on. And so all of these have a different core and a different outer shell. Just as a side note, all of the atoms that we are made up of, which is, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, we're made up of all of these different elements. They were once formed in stars. And so all of the stars, in the universe are undergoing some type of nuclear fusion. And again, this is a side note. You don't need to memorize this. This is just for your own interest. So all of the stars in the universe are currently undergoing some type of nuclear fusion. Like, for example, our sun is fusing hydrogen into helium. So our sun basically fuses hydrogen into helium, and so it makes the next compound. And eventually these stars, some make carbon, some make nitrogen, some make oxygen and whatnot. Eventually, these stars either explode into big supernovas, and those give off all of the atoms. They just blast them into the universe, and some land on planets, And so all of the atoms that you're made up of were once made from stars. Not all of the elements are made from stars, just more of the basic ones. Other ones are made from, here on Earth because they are under certain types of pressure. Maybe they are found in volcanoes or different areas which allow for the conditions to create these atoms. But yeah, so just wanted to let you know that your atoms that you're made up of are billions of years old. You are essentially made from stars. And there's a lot of energy stored in atoms. This is yet another side note. Again, I don't need you to memorize this. And this is, if you've ever heard of the atomic bomb, the one that was like in released in Japan, where it caused this huge explosion. That's because Albert Einstein came up with the equation of E equals mc squared, meaning that a lot of energy is stored in mass. But Einstein, of course, did not make the atomic bomb. I don't want to associate him with that. And by the way, he's my favorite scientist, so that's why I'm even bringing him up. But just know that there's so much energy stored in every single atom. And the way that the atomic bomb was made was by breaking the atom. You're basically splitting it and releasing all of this energy. And so, yeah, so these huge bombs were made from just breaking atoms open. Now, if they didn't have so much energy stored in them, we would easily come apart. Like all of the atoms in our bodies would just disintegrate and come apart if they weren't so strongly bonded together. Again, I don't need you to memorize this, just thought it was interesting to tell you. All right, let's move on. Molecules, I do want you to know what that means. And so molecules are basically either the same types of atoms or different types of atoms bonded together. And so what I mean by bonded is that there are energy bonds that keep them together, and that has to do with their properties and their rules of having a fulfilled octet. But this is not a chemistry class, so I don't need you to know that in detail. I just need you to know that different types of atoms tend to come together and form bonds, and then they create this new type of molecule. So for example, does anybody recognize this molecule here? I'll give you a second to think about it. So this is hydrogen, and this is oxygen. If you said water, you are correct. And so water is a molecule because it is made up of oxygen and 2 hydrogens. So notice here that the atoms, these are the individual atoms, but once they come together and bond together, then they form molecules. And so this is another molecule here called hydroxide. But this right here is an atom. But if 2 magnesiums bind together, then that becomes a molecule. So it's just basically more than one atom binding together to make a different type of compound. And so once these atoms are bonded together, they have a different property. The property that the atoms have as individuals are not the same as the properties when they form a molecule. They change their properties. All right, one other quick interesting thing is that drugs are basically molecules, okay? And the way that a molecule is shaped influences its behavior. And so, for example, if you've ever used Vicks, Vicks is actually, if you look at the name of Vicks, it says methamphetamine, L-methamphetamine. And you're like, okay, wait a minute, methamphetamine. I know meth is considered a drug and that can alter your brain chemistry, but that just depends on the way that this molecule is oriented in space. And so the left-handed version of methamphetamine, the way that is oriented in space, so you notice is facing to the left, is what's used in Vicks. However, if you were to rotate this molecule the other way, to the right, now that becomes the illegal drug methamphetamine, which people know as meth. And so the way that these molecules are formed and the way that they are structured in three-dimensional space has an effect on its behavior. Okay? And so that's why we're interested in understanding what molecules are, because we know that drugs are molecules. Another thing that I want you to know is the difference between molecules that are polar and molecules that are nonpolar. And so molecules that are polar mean that they have a net charge. And so, for example, water molecules are considered polar. In fact, Oxygen tends to have 6 electrons around it, and because it's a bigger atom, it has 6 protons and 6 electrons. When it forms a bond with hydrogen, which hydrogen only has one proton and 1 electron, um, oxygen will act like a bully, and it'll kind of imbalance. It'll kind of pull the electrons towards it because oxygen wants to have a total of 8. Again, this is called the octet rule, but I don't need you to memorize the octet rule. I just need you to understand what it means when molecules have a net charge or do not have a net charge. And I'm just explaining to you how they gain this, but I'm not in any way going to expect you to know which molecules do have a net charge and which ones don't. I would provide that information for you. Anyway, going back. So oxygen, being the bigger atom, basically is like in a tug of war with hydrogen. And so so the way that it bonds with hydrogen is like in an angle. It's not even like in a straight flat line. It's like in an angle just because it's kind of like in a tug of war with both of these. And because it's sort of stealing the electrons from hydrogen, it's sharing, but it's a little bit stealing from it. It tends to be more negative. So notice how I have the negative sign here. It's more negative, negatively charged. And that means that hydrogen, with its proton in its core, is more positive. And so on this end, you have a more positive charge, and on this end, you have a more negative charge because of this tug of war, this unevenness in the distribution of electrons. Whereas nonpolar molecules tend to they share the electrons more evenly. These are like more. It's kind of like sharing with somebody. You tend to be nice to that person. You share equally. So if you have a sandwich, you cut the sandwich evenly in half, and you give the other person the half. But the polar molecule, it's kind of like having pizza slices, and you have the pizza with 8 slices, but you only give your friends 1 each, and you keep most of it. I know it's a really stupid analogy, but it just want you to know about this unevenness of sharing of electrons. Where nonpolar molecules do tend to share, and because they share, they don't have this overall net charge. And so this right here, this molecule here, doesn't have an overall net charge. And so why does this matter? Why do we care about nonpolar and polar? That's because drug molecules have those same properties, and depending on what type of property they have, some drug molecules tend to easily go into our cells because they're nonpolar, whereas other molecules don't easily go into our cells simply because they're polar. And so we'll learn about that more in just a second. All right, so we talked about how water is polar, meaning that it has an unevenness of charges. So there's an outer net charge as a slightly negative and slightly positive. And because of that, it can interact with other molecules. Like, for example, these are other water molecules due to its net charges. And so here, the oxygen is slightly negative. It'll be attracted to the slightly positivity of the other water molecules. And so, it's forming bonds here, and that's why water molecules are attracted to each other. So water molecules are attracted to each other simply because of the slightly positive and slightly negative. And that's also why water is considered to be a good solvent. So if you notice, you can put salt in there, and salt is slightly positively charged, and so it'll be attracted to this negative charge of oxygen. You can put all kinds of different things in water and then mix it, and you'll notice that it mixes pretty well. So it's considered a very good solvent. And that's why our bodies are mostly made up of water because, because of many properties that water has. But water basically helps carry molecules around in our body as well. Whereas nonpolar molecules don't tend to have an outer net charge. And an example of that is lipids. And so lipids are fats. And all of our cells have a cell membrane that's made up of lipids, and so that's nonpolar. And so polar and nonpolar, they don't mix well. And so here's an example of that. Have you ever, when you're washing your oily pan, if you were just to put water on your oily pan, would you be able to remove the oil very easily? And now remember, oil is nonpolar. So when you put water on your oily pan, you're like, okay, this doesn't come off easily. Why is that? Well, that's because polar and nonpolar don't interact very well. They repel against each other. And so then you use soap, and soap is nonpolar. So you use soap and you put it on your oily pan, and the soap helps break down the oils. And that's because soap is also nonpolar, just like the oils that are nonpolar, and they interact better with each other. And so soap can break down oils, and that's why you use soap to wash dishes, is to break down the stuff that water can't do itself. Okay? Same thing with our cell membranes. Our cell membranes are nonpolar, which can be a good thing. That means that it can repel and it can kick out all of the things that are polar, because majority of molecules are actually polar versus nonpolar. So you have way more molecules that are polar than nonpolar. And this is just a way for it to repel things that should not go inside of the cell. All right, moving on. So let's talk about the 4 types of macromolecules. And this is something that all organisms need to survive. And so when we're talking about the criteria of life, what does it take for life to exist? According to Earth, so we're talking about organisms on Earth, maybe the criteria is different on other planets, which I happen to believe that there's definitely a possibility of life on other planets, maybe in other galaxies. But anyway, that's a side note. But these are the 4 important macromolecules. And so what do I mean by macromolecules? Macro meaning big. So these are big molecules that are needed to survive. And those are carbohydrates, which we're all familiar with. We all love carbs. Protein, and so some people drink protein shakes. But remember, proteins are these molecules, biological molecules that our cells use for many functions. Lipids, which are like fats, our cell membranes are made up of lipids. And nucleic acids, I don't know if you've ever heard of this term, nucleic acids. If you have, then you'll know that your DNA is made up of nucleotides. Okay, that's what nucleic acids are. All right. So cells make macromolecules from smaller size molecules. So we're going to stick with the left 4. And so carbohydrates, some example of carbohydrates are polysaccharides, which are made up of many sugars, disaccharides, and monosaccharides. So really the smallest sugar bonds with another sugar to make a disaccharide, and then bonds with a whole bunch of sugars to make polysaccharides. Okay, these are different types of carbohydrates. Lipids are made up of glycerol, fatty acids, and then from fatty acids to triglycerides, and so you build up, okay? And then proteins are made up of individual amino acids and then into peptides, and then peptides are folded to make a protein. Now, when you drink protein shakes, mostly what you're drinking are the individual amino acids, and so that's why when you look at a protein shake, you look at it and you make sure that it has at least 20 amino acids. 20 amino acids are the maximum. This is the amount of amino acids that exist in nature. And so when when you have your protein shake, some people like to look at the ingredients and they'll notice that really what they're looking at are all of the individual amino acids. And nucleic acids, which are basically nucleotides that come together and form RNA and DNA, and that basically stores all of the information that your cells and organelles and organs and your whole body is made up of. These are like the instructions, okay? Again, carbohydrates. This is how a molecule of a carbohydrate looks like. These are just, different structures. Remember, these are molecules, okay? These are macromolecules. And some examples are sugar, starch, cellulose, which is found in plants. And why is it important to have these? Well, because sugar is converted into energy, which is called ATP. And we cannot function without energy. Okay, so that's why we eat carbs. And also carbohydrates in your body are used for structures and things like that. But moving on. All right, proteins are made up of individual amino acids. So for example, this is serine, leucine, phenylalanine, cysteine. And so a protein is basically a long chain of amino acids. And we have lots of different types of proteins in our body. Okay, so not only do we eat them, but our body needs them to have all of these different functions. So have you ever heard of enzymes? So enzymes are the biological catalysts that basically break down or build up molecules. For example, when you eat food, you can't. I mean, you're eating it whole. I mean, you're chewing it up right in your mouth into smaller pieces, but those food molecules wouldn't do any good unless they were broken down further, and that's what enzymes do. Enzymes break it down further, and the energy of the in the food and is basically released because enzymes are breaking them down. And enzymes are proteins. It's a type of protein. Okay. Your muscles are also made up of proteins. Okay. So proteins can also be mechanical and they can be structural. So your nails are made up of proteins. Your hair is made up of proteins. Proteins can also serve as transporters, meaning that they can transport molecules around. Proteins can also serve as channels, meaning that they are embedded in a cell membrane and allow things to go in and out of the cell. Proteins have many functions. They can even be hormones, they can be antibodies. And so that's why it's so important for us to have protein because of all of these multiple roles that proteins have. And just as a side note, your DNA is basically the instructions. Okay, your DNA carries the instructions of how to build proteins. It's just like a huge library of all of the instructions of all of the different types of proteins that you have in your body. Okay. All right, lipids. We said that they're like fats. They're fatty acids. And we care about lipids because our cell membranes, which is basically the membrane that surrounds a cell, is made up of lipids. And they have this non-polar property, meaning that all of the charges are balanced. And because of that, they can repel things like water molecules. Well, not really water molecules. It repels some of it, but not all of it. But it repels bigger molecules that tend to be polar. And because of this repulsion, because it's just sort of like repelling, that means that molecules can't easily enter the cell. And think about why is it a good thing to protect the cell? Why don't you want things to just easily enter into the cell? So the reason why you don't is because you have important organelles, you have DNA, you have important things going on inside of a cell that you don't want to mess up. Kind of like, would you just let anybody in your house? Would you let 100 people in your house? They may mess up your house. Okay? You don't want just anybody in your home. If you want to keep your home maintained, if you want to, you don't want to have your stuff stolen, you wouldn't just let anybody in. And so that's the same thing for a cell. It won't just let anything in. And so lipids, the fats, are a very good way to seal a membrane because of that repulsive non-polar property that it has. And RNA and DNA are basically nucleotides. And so nucleotides like adenine, guanine, cysteine, and adenosine. And by the way, you don't actually have to memorize those. I just need you to know that nucleic acids are nucleotides. These molecules come together and form RNA and DNA. And so RNA is basically the information that is used to make a protein. So this is like a copy of your DNA. And DNA carries the genetic code of all of the proteins that your body is made up of. And so literally every single gene pretty much encodes for a protein. Almost all genes, okay, encode for protein. Some don't, but majority do. And so, yeah, so basically your DNA is basically stores all of your genetic info, okay? So by now you should be able to answer these questions. What is the name of the fundamental building block of all matter? What is a molecule? Which molecule has an outer charge, water or fat? Which one is polar and which one is nonpolar? What are the 4 important biological molecules? What are some examples of proteins? And so these are just, check your knowledge questions. However, the study guide that I have provided for you, you do need to answer all of those questions and you do need to turn that in as your homework assignment. These questions here, you do not need to turn these specific questions in. This is just to check your knowledge. If you want to take a break, just because I've been talking a lot, you can stop here, answer these questions, and then move on. All right, moving on. So now we are building up to larger structures. So we're going to talk about cells and cell organelles. There are two types of cells, eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Eukaryotes are the cells that most organisms are made up of. They contain a DNA. All cells have DNA, but eukaryotes have a nucleus that basically um, encases the DNA, and so it's like a membrane that surrounds the DNA, and it also has membrane-bound organelles, so like mitochondria, um, Golgi apparatus, ribosomes, all these different organelles that we're going to learn about in a second. And prokaryotes are the more basic type of cells. These are the cells that came before the eukaryotes, and so these are the most like ancient type of cells, which are like the bacteria, archaea, for example. And so these type of cells tend to live alone. They are unicellular, meaning that they live alone, and they don't have a membrane-bound nucleus, and so that means there's no membrane that protects the DNA, and they don't have mitochondria, and they just basically have ribosomes to make proteins. So let's look at prokaryotic cells first. Remember, these are the most ancient type of cells. These are the most basic. And so some examples are archaea and bacteria. And so all bacteria are prokaryotes. This is a type of bacteria here. Even the structures are different. This looks like a pill shape. Some of them have these little projections. These are called pili, which helps them move around in liquid mediums. They have cell walls and cell membranes, so they have both. They have ribosomes to make proteins, and they have DNA, which is just hanging out in the cell. It's not protected at all, so it's not like in the center of the cell. It's just sort of floating around everywhere. And that's it, pretty much. These type of cells are very basic. And what's an issue with not protecting your DNA? So, for example, if you just have DNA hanging out here and it's not protected by a nucleus, what do you think can be some potential problems? If you said genetic mutations, then that's correct. So outside foreigners like viruses can easily just come in and mess with the DNA, and that can be detrimental to the cell. And so eukaryotic cells are the more evolved type of cells, which most organisms are made up of, and they have come up with a way to protect the nucleus, to protect the DNA, which is a nucleus. And so nucleus keeps foreign invaders out, like viruses and whatnot, keeps it from manipulating the DNA. And examples of eukaryotic cells are animals, plants, fungi, and protista. Let's talk about the components of the cell. And so cells have a cell membrane. So this is a membrane here that protects the organelles. It has a cytoplasm, which is the fluid that all of the organelles are just kind of hanging out, swimming around in there. Because there's so much activity going on in a cell. There's so much metabolism going on. There's so many proteins floating around, and so the cytoplasm is like this medium in which they can move around in. The nucleus, which we said was in the center, protects the DNA, and DNA, here's a little smiley face in this case. Mitochondria, which are these bean-shaped structures. These are organelles as well. Endoplasmic reticulum, which surrounds the nucleus. Ribosomes, which are all of these little dots here, the free ribosomes and the ones that are bound to the ER. And Golgi apparatus, which is probably the little blue structures here. Oh no, sorry, it's right here. My bad. This is definitely the Golgi apparatus, but we'll talk about what it does in detail in a second. All right, so cell membrane, we talked a little bit about it earlier, is the part that basically encases the cells. Why have a cell membrane? For the same reason that you have doors and locked doors, that is, for your own house, because you just don't want any foreigners to enter your house, right? All of your stuff will be missing. You wouldn't be able to function in a house in which anybody can just go in and out. And so it's the same thing with the cell membrane. So the cell membrane protects the organelles that are inside of the cell and the DNA as well. And the cell membrane is made up of fats, lipids, and so it's nonpolar, mostly nonpolar. It has some polarity, but we're not going to learn about that in detail. But because it's mostly nonpolar, it's a great way to repel things that are polar. It keeps a lot of things out just by repulsion, just because they don't attract to each other. The cytoplasm is just the fluid substance that's inside of the cell. And so this fluid substance, allows these organelles to sort of move around, and it allows proteins to move around as well, because there's so much metabolic activity going inside of a cell that a lot of things are moving rapidly, constantly. Okay, and what's interesting is that there are thousands of functions going on in every single one of your cells, and you have millions and millions of cells, and all of these need to be working accordingly in order for you to stay alive. And so it's sort of like, it's pretty much a miracle that we are all alive and that we can survive for so long, given that all of these different functions need to occur um, at a high rate every second of your existence. Nucleus, we said, is the membrane that protects the DNA. And so this is basically what DNA kind of looks like under a microscope. It's sort of like a spaghetti mesh, unless it forms chromosomes. And again, we said that the DNA is basically these are made up of nucleotides. DNA is basically stores all of your genetic information. And so in order to encode the DNA, so DNA needs to be copied first. And so an RNA is basically a copy of DNA. And then that RNA turns into a protein. And then the protein has so many functions. You're made up of proteins. It has so many functions that it basically is the reason why an organism even exists in the first place, because it's made up of all these different types of proteins that are encoded in our genes. Have you ever heard that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell? Well, what people mean by that is that mitochondria is responsible for generating all of the energy that your cells need. And that molecule that mitochondria makes is called ATP. And so ATP is the energy molecule that all living organisms use. And this is basically energy for your cells. And so without energy, nothing can be done. And so if you didn't have energy in your home, you wouldn't be able to turn on the lights. You wouldn't be able to use your computer. So we need energy to survive. And mitochondria is responsible for making that energy that is called ATP. And what is energy used for? So your enzymes, some enzymes use ATP, all of the metabolic activity to make, if you want to make proteins, you need ATP. If you want to move your muscles when you're working out, you need to have ATP. If you want to run during exercise, you are doing an exercise, you want to run. Just thinking alone, me speaking right now, everything that I'm doing, I need ATP to do it. It's pretty much like the electricity that my body needs to stay alive. The endoplasmic reticulum is basically the part, or it's an organelle in which proteins, remember we said that proteins are super important, that our genes store the information for proteins. This is the region, the endoplasmic reticulum, basically can make proteins more complex. And so when a protein is first made, it's very basic. It's kind of like having, let's say you have a Cadillac, and you just have the very basic version of a Cadillac. But let's say you wanted to make that Cadillac really cool. You wanted to add more parts to it. You wanted to maybe make the rims better, and you wanted to lower it, and you wanted to add, I don't know, a stereo system or something. The endoplasmic reticulum is basically where it modifies proteins. It makes them more complex. It'll add more parts to it. And why would we want to make a protein more complex? Because the structure of the protein relates to its function. And so the more complex it is, the more stuff that it can do. Okay? And so the ER, basically, there's smooth ER and rough ER. It's basically the center for modifying proteins and also for making lipids. And so this is where the cell membrane lipids are made, and steroids. Okay? So ER makes lipids, steroids, and modifies proteins, which means that it basically adds more different parts to proteins. For example, it can add like glycogen sugars onto it and make it more complex. The ribosomes are basically the site where proteins are made. And so we know that genes store the information for proteins. We know that genes can turn, we know that RNA takes the information from a gene. So RNA takes the information from DNA. And then the RNA goes straight to the ribosome. And then the ribosome is sorry, this is not the ribosome here. The ribosome are these little dots. It's this is like kind of like cookie dough, and these are chocolate chips. And so the little chocolate chips are the ribosomes. And by the way, this bigger structure here is the ER, the one that we just talked about earlier, the endoplasmic reticulum. And so when a protein is synthesized in the ribosomes, they are either released into the endoplasmic reticulum to be further modified, or or some of the proteins that are made from the ribosomes are just hanging out in the cytoplasm, and they have other functions. Maybe they don't need to be modified and they can be readily used. But so sorry, I'm getting tongue twisted here. But the ribosomes are the main site. Okay, this is what I need you to know in bold here. This is the site where proteins are made. And so remember, we said that DNA stores the information, and then RNA is a copy of DNA. The RNA needs to be translated somewhere, and it is translated here at the ribosome, in which, when it's translated, a protein is made. And we also learned that proteins have many functions, right? So they can be enzymes, they can form your muscles, your hair, your nails, your skin. It's part of your immune system. And so that's why it's so important to make these proteins, because they have so many functions. The Golgi is basically the site in which proteins are transported to different parts of the cell. And so some proteins are made inside of a cell, but then are transported outside of the cell to another destination. Some proteins are sent maybe to the mitochondria to repair maybe the mitochondria or to make a new mitochondria. Some proteins are sent to your bloodstream as to become antibodies. Some proteins are used to make muscles, and so the Golgi apparatus is basically like the UPS, or the USPS, whatever. UPS, same thing. The UPS is basically if you want to mail an item, let's say you bought a gift for your mom who lives in Northern California, like my mom, and I want to mail her something. I would go to the UPS and I would package my item so that it can be sent. And so the Golgi apparatus, what it does is that it packages proteins, and it sends it to other parts of the cell. So the synthesized proteins that come from the ER are then sent to the Golgi and are packaged and sent off to other parts of the cells. And so that is the definition of the Golgi apparatus. It is like the UPS. It packages things and sends it to other different parts of the cell within or outside of the cell. Okay? And the reason why I repeat myself a lot is because I feel like it helps people memorize things better. And so sometimes I tend to repeat myself a lot. All right, so at this point, this is again questions for you to check your understanding. So at this point, you should understand what is the difference between prokaryote and eukaryote. What is the function of a nucleus? What kind of information does DNA store? Which organelle produces energy for the cell? Which organelle synthesizes proteins? Which organelle packages proteins to be sent to other organelles? Which organelle modifies proteins? What are proteins made of? So you should be able to know all of this information according to this lecture. All right, now moving on to part 2. I believe the second PowerPoint is shorter than this. This is probably the longest one I have made so far.